In today's video, I'm going to be interviewing one of my preferred real estate attorneys, Patrick Kelly, the proud owner of the Kelly Law Firm located right here in the Chicagoland area. My goal in real estate is to work with people who are crushing it in their industry and changing the way things are done while chasing fulfillment and, of course, having fun, because what else is there? In this video, you can expect everything from the legal perspective when buying, selling, and investing in real estate. So without any further delay, let's hop right into it. All right, so I'm super excited to be interviewing Patrick Kelly with the Kelly Law Firm today. I work with a lot of different people from out of state or moving from downtown Chicago out to the suburbs, or vice versa, the suburbs to downtown Chicago, and it might be one of their first real estate transactions. And a lot of people think it's just swiping on their phones, looking at properties and going in person, and they miss out on a lot of the moving pieces that are involved with actually closing on a house. One of them happens to be using a real estate attorney such as Patrick. So I'm really excited today to interview him to kind of discuss exactly what he does along in the process and have him fill you in on how he's valuable in the transaction. And Patrick and I work quite a bit together. We've probably done a few dozen transactions, so he's one of my preferred real estate attorneys. So if you do reach out off of this video, whether it's to buy, sell, or invest in real estate, it's possible Patrick and you will be working together along with me. So without any further ado, how are you doing today, Patrick?
Good. Thanks very much for having me.
No problem. Like I said, I've been looking forward to doing this for a while. And this is actually my first in-person interview because of the whole pandemic. And, most of them have been on Zoom calls. So I'm really excited to do something in person for once. And it's really nice. So let's hop right into it. We're going to discuss kind of when you get involved in the process. So, using an attorney varies from state to state. And sometimes when I talk with people coming from a different country or a different state, and I mention using a real estate attorney, they kind of look at me and go, what do I need that person for? So basically here in Illinois, it's common practice to use an attorney. And I've never done a transaction without one. In what stage of the purchase or the sale of real estate do you actually come into the picture?
Yeah, all great questions. So every state is different. Many states don't use attorneys, but Illinois does. It's not an absolute requirement. You don't have to have an attorney. But to your point, almost every transaction does have one in Illinois. And I think that we do help the process go much smoother. I know Illinois generally, compared to other states, has less litigation, less title claims, less issues after the closing, in my opinion, in part because attorneys are involved and we make sure that clients on both sides, sellers or buyers, are protected as fully as possible. Because for a lot of people, most people really, this is the largest purchase you're going to make.
Right.
The biggest contract you're going to be a part of, maybe to that point in your life or at any point in your life, right? So I think it makes sense to have professionals, and you mentioned there's a lot of different facets to the transaction. It's not just looking at your phone and finding a house.
Right.
They have you, obviously, as the primary point person, and then if you're on the buy side, you have your lender, attorney, you got to talk to an insurance person, and there's a lot of different phases. My role is making sure all of those phases come together, run smoothly, and we get you to the closing table and get the deal closed as smoothly and easily as possible.
Awesome. Okay, so when do exactly, from a person looking at homes, putting something under contract, do you actually come into the process? When would someone actually have the first conversation with you?
No, good question. So timing-wise, not always, but usually I become involved right when the contract gets signed.
Okay.
Every once in a while, a client might send me a contract in draft form to say, hey, can you take a look at this? And I'm always happy to do that on the seller or the buyer side. If the buyer has a question about a particular paragraph of the contract, I'm happy to talk to them and walk them through that. But usually I get involved once the contract's been signed by the buyer and by the seller, and then I'll get the contract from the client or from you. We'll send it over, and then I'll start looking through it at that point.
Okay, gotcha. And that's called the attorney review period.
Right. So very literally, we review the contract.
So basically here in Illinois, once you go under contract with a seller, if you're on the buy side or if you're a seller trying to sell your house and you get a contract with a buyer, it begins the 5-day attorney review and inspection period.
Correct.
So 5 business days for the attorney review period. So what typically happens at that point in the transaction?
Right. So the date that the seller signs the contract is the date that we work off of moving forward. We call it the date of acceptance. So typically the buyer signs it when they make an offer. Then the seller signs it when the offer is accepted and a price has been agreed upon. That date the seller signs it is the date of acceptance, and we have 5 business days, like you said, from that date for attorney review or inspection issues to be raised. And so that's really the very first thing that I do is review the contract. I'll look through it, make sure that everything's been filled out properly, see if there's any little changes that might be necessary. And then I will draft a letter. We always draft a letter, an attorney review letter. That includes two different sections. So the first part is the attorney review section with modifications to the contract or questions that we want to raise. And I always almost have 7, 8, maybe 10 modifications that we include in every letter just to protect our buyer clients as fully as possible.
Sure.
So the contract has a lot in there. It's 13 pages.
Yeah.
Contains a lot of detail. Then there's another, 7 or 8 pages worth of disclosures that has even more detail. But even with all those documents, there still are a few things that I personally don't think are fully covered. And so we ask in this letter just to protect our buyer clients as fully as we possibly can. So we ask things like, has the seller filed any homeowner's insurance claims that we might want to know about?
Okay.
Is there an issue with the roof or flooding or anything of that nature? We'll ask if they pulled all the permits they were supposed to pull when they did renovation work. We'll ask if there have been any water problems. And the disclosure sort of covers that,
Sure.
but not quite as fully as I would like it to.
Yeah.
So we raise those, and then while that time period is going on, a lot of things happen quickly.
Right.
So during that first 5 business days, I'll be doing that, and then also the buyer will be having an inspection done on the home.
Okay.
And maybe other inspections, a radon test or mold test, anything that the buyer might be concerned about with the
Sure.
home. And that inspection has to happen within those first 5 business days, because by the end of that 5th business day, by 6 p.m., I have to send a letter to the seller's attorney with any inspection-related requests that our buyers might have. So that letter gets prepared. All that happens in 5 days.
Yeah.
Right? I review the contract, discuss it with our client. The client has an inspection done, and then you or the client let me know if any issues came up, and then I draft the letter. I'll send it to our client to review, and I need to get that letter to the seller's attorney by, how I say, the end of the day on that 5th business day.
Okay. Love it. Yeah, you summed it up perfectly. You summed it up perfectly. All right, so tell us, once you submit this letter, tell us what happens after it gets submitted typically.
Sure. So I send it directly to the seller's attorney, and then role reversal. If I'm on the seller side, what I do is immediately send that to my seller client to review it and go through it with them. So the seller's attorney would be doing that. They'd say, hey, here's what these questions are. How do we answer them? Here's some modifications. I think we should agree to this, or maybe not on this one. And then the seller's attorney would work with the sellers to figure out how they want to answer these inspection requests.
Sure.
And we might get a few types of responses back. It might be, yes, we'll make the repairs.
Yeah.
Might be, no, we won't. It might be, we'll offer you a credit to resolve them instead of making. The seller's attorney would then send a response letter back to me, and I would discuss it with our buyer clients, right? And you were all kind of on a team.
Yeah, right.
We would, oftentimes it'll go through email so everybody can see the letter, but then we might have a phone call, a conference call where we can jump on the line and say, hey, here's how they responded. Are you good with all the responses?
Sure.
Do we want to push back on anything? And that negotiation sometimes is very easy. Sometimes we reach an agreement immediately. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah, I've been on both sides with you, where sometimes it's like pulling teeth, and
Right.
other times it's smooth sailing. So
Right.
just want to reiterate to everybody out there, here in Illinois, it has to be a major component of the house. It can't be, we don't like the paint color, so we want Mr. Seller to fix that.
Right.
It has to be something major structurally or a safety issue that you can ask for, and that's written in clear language in the contract.
It is, absolutely.
And then obviously when I'm advising a buyer or a seller, I'm reminding them of those features, and of
Right.
course you are on your end as well.
Right. Yeah, because it can result in a new negotiation.
Right.
But that can be dangerous. If you like the house and want to buy it,
Mhm.
if there is a serious problem, then we should raise it and address it.
Yeah.
But if not, you don't want to really reopen the contract and risk losing a house over a $50 issue with a loose sink or something.
No, absolutely.
So-
and I've seen it happen, and you and I
Absolutely.
have been involved with that, where one of the parties asks for some ridiculous things,
Right.
and the contract ends up falling through, or someone else comes and makes an offer, and the seller decides to go with that other offer and cancels the agreement. So it gets
Right.
kind of sticky sometimes with things you ask for and whether you should or shouldn't.
Right, because technically, until any issues raised in that attorney review period are resolved, either side has the right to walk away from that transaction. And some people find that funny,
Yeah.
and which I understand, but because you have a signed contract, and some clients think, well, I've got a signed contract, that's it. But it's really not until you get through that attorney review period. That's when the contract is full and final and official, and you can have certainty you're going to move forward. But until you hit that point, either side could walk away from the transaction.
Yep, absolutely. All right, so once both parties to the transaction actually reach an agreement on that attorney review letter and they sign off on it, what's the next step? What happens from there?
Sure. From there, there's a lot of logistics that have to happen, and it should be easier for the buyer. There's not that many things for the buyer to do at that point, but from the back end, from the attorney's perspective and the lender and the title company, there's a lot that's still happening, right? Primarily the loan. That's the critical piece, right? To make sure that the lender has everything they need from the buyer to clear the loan. They also need a lot of information from the title company. There's always a title insurance policy involved to ensure that the buyer is receiving clean title to the property. I help with that, so I communicate with the title company and the lender to make sure everybody's talking to one another and getting what they need, and also working with the seller attorney to make sure they're providing any information that's needed. So it's kind of there's a lot of moving pieces, and I try to sort of act as the captain of that ship to make sure we get to the place we want to get to, which is eventually the closing table.
Yeah, that's the main goal, to get you guys the house you want, and if you're selling your house, to make sure that you can get your equity out and move on to do whatever you want to do with it. All right, so what are the last few steps, and maybe you've already touched on this, the days leading up to the closing, and can you kind of cover what happens at that point?
Absolutely, yeah. So then when you get closer to closing, there are a number of things that have to happen, and they involve, again, the lender and the title company. One of the critical pieces is balancing all the figures. So the buyer ultimately needs to know how much money to bring to the closing, right?
Right.
And the seller's going to want to know how much they're going to
That would be pretty important to know how much you're actually bringing to the closing.
It is, right? And it's actually been more important, I would say, just in the past year or two, I've seen a shift in the timing on that. So you say the last few days you asked about. And I would say a number of years ago, typically that balancing process where we reach the final number did happen just in the last few days. And still, oftentimes it does.
Sure.
I've really made an effort over the last couple of years to move that up a little bit to maybe the last week or even 2 weeks as opposed to a day or two. One reason is buyers, especially you mentioned some buyers coming from out of town. There can be an issue with people's banks. So it used to be so you have to bring money to the closing. The only two ways you can do it are either a cashier's check or a wire transfer. You can't show up with cash to the title company, or a personal check. Title companies will not accept a personal check. So either you have a cashier's check, and even that's only acceptable if the amount's under $50,000. If it's more than $50,000, you have to send a wire transfer. And some banks are easier than others to do that.
I'm sure some banks are easier to work with than others.
Yeah, and some of the big banks, it's easy. You call them or you walk in. Oh, well, even that's tricky. Some will let you call. Some make you walk in.
Oh, okay.
And if you don't have a branch close to you, and if the client doesn't find that out sometimes until the day or two before the closing, they'll say, well, I don't have a bank close by, so how am I supposed to do that? And that can be a real problem. So I've been trying to make a real effort to get these numbers and instructions to buyers early, as early as possible. How I say, especially if they're out of state, if it's a small bank in a different state and they're traveling here and don't have access to that branch, you've got to have that lined up ahead of time. So one, getting the number and figuring out logistically, it sounds silly, but practically how you're going to get that money to the title company. And then also scheduling the closing. Again, it might sound silly, but there's a lot of people's schedules involved there, primarily the clients, but also the title company. They have to have availability. The attorney on the other side has to be available. The lender, it has to work for them. So that's something my office does as well, is coordinate all those individuals and make sure we find a date, time, location for the closing to actually make sense.
Scheduling a half a dozen people's schedules isn't easy?
Not always so easy.
I always thought it was.
But we make it work.
You make it work. All right. Hey, I always joke with people when you actually get to the title company for the closing, practice your signature up front and your favorite blue ink, because that's all. That's the only color ink that they'll allow you to use. So. How many documents would you say does a buyer and a seller roughly need to sign for the closing? On average. I know it's different every time.
Good question. So the seller has a little less.
Okay.
And sellers actually usually sign ahead of time. So almost, and that even predated COVID. Actually, it's just a little bit easier, and the seller side is much shorter, so they don't have to sit through the whole buyer side closing. So sellers usually sign ahead of time, and they have maybe 10 or 15 documents to sign. When I have a seller client, I'll have them meet at my office a week or two prior to the closing, and that takes only 15 or 20 minutes.
Oh, wow.
On the buyer side, if you're closing with a loan, it's going to take a while. If a buyer's paying cash, it's pretty easy and quick. You might also have maybe 10 or 12 documents to sign, and a closing might only take 20 or 30 minutes.
Okay.
If you're closing with a loan, you'll probably have, say 50 documents to sign, roughly. Depends on the lender and the transaction, but give or take 50 documents. And I tell people to give about an hour to an hour and a half on their schedule for a closing. So it's not that bad, but it's about 60 to 90 minutes. And yes, you're going to sign a number of times.
You're going to get a packet like this thick,
right?
And you're going to be going through there. Your hands, your signature will progressively get worse. As you go through.
And that's another thing we do as an attorney in the process is, that packet is not really that different from closing to closing. It's a lot of standardized loan documents that I know what they are.
Right.
I've seen a lot of times. And so I can usually sit down with the buyer, get them through that packet, and we try to make it an easy to understand process for buyers. So I can show them quickly what they need to sign, explain to them what the document is, and try to cut through a lot of the legalese, which is, dozens or hundreds of pages.
Well, that's your language, the legalese.
So we try to make it easy and understandable.
Good. Yeah, he does a great job with that. I've watched him do it many, many times, and it's fantastic. He even helped me with my house, so he explained it perfectly over the phone during COVID.
That's it.
All right. So, in your opinion, why are your services essential in the real estate process? If you could sum it up.
Yeah, I think to sum it up briefly, it's just to protect our clients as fully as possible. Like I said earlier, it's the largest transaction that most people are going to have in their lifetime, and we want to make sure that when you're committing that much money and buying something that's as much of a long-term asset as a home is, that everything is covered from a legal perspective, the documents are correct and as they should be, and that you have everything go smoothly and properly the way that it should.
Okay, awesome. And just to prove that you are great at what you do, how many real estate closings on average would you say your office does per week?
Per week?
Or per month,
so,
whatever number you want to throw out there.
In the course of a year, we probably do somewhere between 400 to 500.
Oh my gosh! Okay.
So if you average that out per week, I guess 8 to 10 per week.
Okay.
It's a little busier in the summer, spring and summer, of course, right? Is when a lot of closings happen. Now on the holidays, we get a little bit of a breather. So we get to enjoy the holidays here at the end of the year, and then things will pick back up in the spring. But over the course of a year, it's somewhere between 400 to 500.
Wow, that is a large number. You must have your systems down. You must have some help in your office.
Yes, I've got it. Yeah, it's not just me. We've got some help. I've got 2 other attorneys that work for me, and 2 paralegals.
Awesome.
So we've got very good systems in place to make sure everything is calendared when it needs to be calendared, and all the documents are prepared the way they need to be and reviewed the way they need to be. So everything runs kind of like clockwork.
He's been doing it for a while. His team communicates fantastic, which is one of the main things I ask for.
Right.
With the people that I partner my business with.
Communication is critical.
Yeah, and you're always available for me. You're always able to talk with people that I'm helping buying or selling.
I always tell people this is our office line right here.
There you go.
So realtors, you guys work all the time, weekends, evenings, and so I really make an effort to do the same.
Yeah, and you do a great job.
And when people are involved in their largest transaction of their life, they sometimes have questions that come up outside business hours, right? And so I'm here to make sure they get the answers they need when they need them.
Yeah, and you're fantastic with that. I couldn't ask for anything else from you. So that kind of sums up the whole using an attorney for your real estate transaction here in Illinois. And I have a few extra questions for you. It's called my fire round. If you're up for it.
Let's give it a try.
So what's the most bizarre thing you've ever seen on your end in real estate?
Oh boy, there's a lot.
I'm sure there is.
There's some of the condition of some houses you see more than I do firsthand, but some of the things you see and hear about in a house can really shock you sometimes. One recent one that was a surprise. So we're talking about people coming from out of state.
Yeah.
We had a client who was buying from another state, and we scheduled the closing. I scheduled it with them. Said here's where it's going to be, when it's going to be. The client actually traveled to Europe on the closing date.
Oh, nice.
And just assumed they could sign
remotely?
From Europe, remotely.
Wow.
And that is an option. So that's something I'm trying to talk to my buyers about early on now as well,
Okay.
is that if you can't make it, especially if you're from out of state, we can maybe use a power of attorney or some other method to make whatever the client's situation is, we'll make it work. But you need to let me know.
Right.
So that was a big surprise when our buyer was in Croatia on the closing day, and no one knew it until that morning. And that closing did not happen that day, but we worked with the embassy and expedited a power of attorney and got it closed a few days later. But that was a surprise.
That is a bizarre story.
And
I'm glad you were able to help them still.
Things like that in real estate happen, where
Yeah.
surprises happen, and you've got to be able to adjust and make it work. And we try to find ways to do that.
Awesome. All right. Well, what other services does your law firm provide or perform?
So at this point, none. To
Okay.
be honest, we only focus on residential real estate transactions.
Okay.
So I've done a number of things over the years. I used to do litigation. I
Yeah.
did some trial work. I did some small business work and represented dental offices was a niche I had. But the more my real estate practice grew, the more I came to really love working in that field. And kind of the more you do, the more clients you
Yeah.
meet and realtors
No,
you meet.
absolutely.
And so at this point, that is all that we do, all of our
Okay.
focus. And to me, that's been a positive, because I think if you focus on one thing, you can just make sure you do that one thing real well.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. How can people get a hold of you?
So I'm easy to find. So I always save my phone. Text, call, email anytime. So phone number 630-660-4963. I've got a website. The Kelly Law Firm in
Okay.
Naperville, and all my contact information's on the website. Email, phone, fax, and I'm around.
Awesome. All right. Anything else that you think people should know about your law firm or using an attorney in the real estate transaction before we wrap this up?
I think just know that we are here to make sure that the transaction goes as smoothly as possible for you. And,
Okay.
and I know I've said it, but to make sure that you are protected as fully as possible. We totally understand the significance of these transactions for clients and are here to help you through the process and make sure you get the result you're looking for.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll put Patrick's information down in the description box below. If you ever have any questions about real estate law, you're welcome to reach out to him and his law firm. And until next time, we'll catch you guys later.